live.
Hello, everyone from around the world. My name is Chris Kozak. I'm in Tokyo, Japan, and I'm part of Amnesty International. And we're going to start our program very soon. We're having a few technical difficulties. Our guests are in Washington, D.C. or very near Washington, D.C. And there's a thunderstorm, which might affect internet speeds and or power. So I'm just going to hold the show until we get everyone back on track. We've got volunteers frantically running around trying to connect either through phone or other means. So please stand by. Right now in Tokyo, it's relatively cool, but we're coming out of rainy season, hopefully. We had a lot of rain in the last 48 hours. There's an area in Japan that got a lot of rain, and a lot of homes have been destroyed. And that is complicating the fact that there are record numbers of coronavirus cases. Tokyo alone saw 366 coronavirus cases yesterday. We are fortunate that we live in a society where masks are very prevalent. It doesn't, especially in the winter when there's flu season and cold season, I would say a vast majority of people use masks, especially on crowded subways and at their workplaces, and even single people driving their cars would wear masks. So even though the summer season is coming soon and it's going to be 35 degrees, 36 degrees. Last year we saw temperatures of 40 degrees. People are still going to wear masks. So I think that's going to help mitigate the effects of the coronavirus. There are policies in place that everyone knows about to social distance. If you go to playgrounds, you will see signs reminding people to stay 2 meters away from each other, to wash your hands, and to stay away from situations where you're in close contact with people. So we're still waiting to get connected a little bit. So I can tell you a little bit about Amnesty International. You might know what we are already, but just in case, Amnesty International, they have a motto where it's better to light a candle than to curse the darkness. That's why the Amnesty logo is a candle. It's the sign of freedom and the sign of thought. And Amnesty International is a global movement of more than 7 million people who take injustice personally. We campaign for a world where human rights are enjoyed by all. We are funded by members and people just like you. We are independent of any political ideology, economic interest, or religion. Amnesty International regularly puts out reports that discuss the quality of governments and their democracies. And I urge you to go online and find your country and find out how they score. There are important issues in the world where right-wing ideologues have been in leadership roles trying to diminish democracy all over the world. Even where I'm from in Canada, the situation is not immune to leaders who take the opportunity, like the coronavirus, and use a kind of disaster capitalism to strip rights from institutions and criminalize protest. So it's important to remain vigilant. Amnesty International is also very worried about the death penalty in certain jurisdictions in the world. And it's important that we keep the information available. Amnesty also investigates and exposes the facts whenever and wherever abuses happen. They lobby governments and other powerful groups such as companies, and they make sure to keep their promises with respect to international law. By telling the powerful stories of the people we work with, we mobilize millions of supporters around the world to campaign for change and to stand in defense of activists on the front line. We support people to claim their rights through education and training. And if you go to the Amnesty website, you will see videos and links to all sorts of campaigns. Okay, and it's very important to continue to research. The founder of Amnesty International, Peter Benison, has a quote: "Only when the last prisoner of conscience has been freed, when the last torture chamber has been closed, when the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a reality for the world's people, will our work be done." My dream is to not have to say that quote anymore. But citizenship is an important process that is never finished. I talk with my colleagues in Tokyo and Japan all the time about how to increase the power of citizenship and citizens' democracy. And there are networks and organizations working very hard all the time to try and promote democracy and citizenship. And it takes time, it takes effort. So I thank you for showing up. I thank you for your patience. We're almost ready. Thank you for standing by. Our topic today is Black Lives Matter. Hopefully we can also begin this conversation about how the Black Lives Matter movement works within the context of Tokyo and Japan and Asia. We will soon be hearing from our speakers, and as soon as we get connected. How are we doing? Oh, we'll talk about, yeah. Let's see here. Do I have information about the petition? Very soon you will get information about a petition. And I encourage you to sign that petition. Within the context of Black Lives Matter in America, it's something we must fight from the grassroots level, because there is not so much leadership at the top. It's disheartening when ice cream companies are more involved with the Black Lives Matter movement than the office of the president. But organizations all over the world, including 350.org and Extinction Rebellion and Fridays for Future, that are involved in climate negotiations and climate mitigation and climate participation, are also participating in the Black Lives Matter movement. In Tokyo, about a month ago, we had a protest and a very peaceful march where approximately 3,500 people participated. I was part of that as well, and I was waiting for about an hour and a half, and I heard some noise from behind me, and it was the front of the march that had come around and finished. And so there were already, even though the front had already walked all the way around the Shibuya district of Tokyo, we were still waiting to continue to march and show our solidarity with Black Lives Matter. Some of the organizers of Black Lives Matter were also members of the LGBT community, and the good news is we've got our participants logging on, plugging in. Good thing they didn't lose the power from the storm, and we're getting connected soon. Thank you again, everyone, for your patience, and thanks everyone for fighting all the technical difficulties. So, Chrissy, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Chris.
Great. And Beverly, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you well.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you, everyone online around the world, in DC, in Tokyo, for your patience. I'm just going to quickly introduce from Washington, D.C., activist Beverly Smith, whose 27-year-old son, Alonzo Smith, was killed by the police 5 years ago. He was the father of 3 young children. Kristina Roth from Amnesty International USA is also here to join us, offering her expertise on the incidences of police violence in the USA and to tell us more about what activists are doing to stop it. Please, those listening, please send your messages and your questions and your comments in the chat, and we hope to address as many of those as possible. Please join the discussion to fight against racism and police accountability, and to think about what we all can do. Please give us advice about how to have this conversation in the context of the Japanese culture, or with our Japanese friends, or with our Japanese half friends, which is the strange term for interracial children, for example, Canadian Japanese kids. So post your questions. I'm going to pass this on to Kristina, but before, I'm just going to say a few words about her amazing work. Kristina Roth is the Senior Advocate for Criminal Justice Programs at Amnesty International USA. She oversees the organization's work to abolish the death penalty and stop unlawful killings by police. She serves as an expert on these matters and works regularly with grassroots activists. She has been published in The Guardian, The Washington Post, Deutsche Welle, AJ+, and other media outlets. Please, Kristina, I'm glad you're connected, and please take the floor, and welcome, and thank you very much for your time.
Absolutely. It's so wonderful to be with you all. And, we are all adjusting to these times in the times of COVID, and certainly fighting a totally separate pandemic here in the US, and that racism is alive and well, as it has been for over 400 years. And so I'm so glad to be here with you all tonight. As Chris said, I lead Amnesty International USA's work to abolish the death penalty, and also our work to stop unlawful use of lethal force by police. And so I'm going to talk briefly about the circumstances in the US that are relevant to this moment, give a bit more background on the rights that we have, all the human rights that we have, and what we're working to try to change. So as I mentioned very briefly, as I understand the more conversations I have with our colleagues around the globe, that there's something that feels very unique about American racism that is not always understood in other countries. And it is quite clear that our justice system, or as some may refer to, penal system, very much it has grown out of, particularly as with regard to policing, out of the institution of slavery. And so when people say 400 years, just last year, I believe, was the 400th anniversary of when the first slaves arrived in Virginia from Africa. And so that is a part of our history that we as Americans, I would say, our original sin that is certainly never been resolved. And so the institution, as slavery was eventually abolished, in order to sort of deal with that moment, that became police that were really originally slave patrols, and they sort of transformed over the years and generations to take on other roles that were about sort of regulating Black bodies very much at that point in history. And that transformed over the years, as well as we think about the Reagan era police being very focused on combating the war on drugs, which of course was very much more focused on targeting people of color as well. And then we move even into modern day policing. It's still very much true that people of color are far overrepresented in those that are impacted by violence at the hands of police. On a very top level sense, we know that African Americans or Black people, like myself and Beverly, make up about 13% of the U.S. population. However, about 25% of those that are killed by police. It's unfortunately also true that about 1 in 1,000 Black men are likely to die at the hands of police in their lifetime. And so, while we are right now, the world is waking up to this trauma, it is something that a lot of people sits with them and has sat with them for a very long time. We in the US have this problem in the way that it's also true that about 1,000 people are killed by police annually in the US, despite the fact that the federal government doesn't keep track of all of these killings. But, talking with even just one person, like we'll hear from Beverly, it's very clear that if your loved one is the one that's been lost, then that's enough, right? We don't need to know exactly how many people are killed by police, because even one is too many. And so far too often, it's likely done in a way that may be excessive and unnecessary. So in addition to having a large number of people that are impacted by these killings, the other important part to know about the way this problem persists in the US is there's very little accountability for these incidents as well. So considering the large number of people that are impacted of all of those events, even over the course of between 2015 and 2019, something like maybe 5 of those cases were prosecuted, only 3 of them resulted in convictions that actually stuck, which meant probably that officer received some criminal charges or may have served some time in jail. So that should be alarming to understand, particularly in considering that other wealthy nations, maybe European nations, there may be a handful of people that are killed by police over a couple years. And so we sit in a very different category all on our own. So that's a bit to know about what the US. I'm going to talk briefly about what sort of rights we have and how this relates. It's the case everywhere, certainly, not only in the US, but here in the US, we are a party to some international, and apologies, I can hear the storm raging, so I hope that that's not too loud. We all have human rights when we interact with police, and so those key rights to understand are that we have a right to life, or a right to survive an interaction with a police officer. We have a right to be safe. We have a right to be free from discrimination, and we have a right to be equally protected under the law. And those are things that we should all have as human beings. That doesn't mean that they are true for all individuals in the US. And so I want us to think about that as we move throughout the conversation and consider both where we have been in American history and where we are in this moment. Are those human rights really guaranteed? And it's the work of Amnesty to push for them, but it's our observation that they're really not. So after the killing of George Floyd, and again, this problem is not new at all. Thinking back even just to the 90s, the last time there was such an eruption of this was in LA when Rodney King was killed in 1991, which is also caught on camera. This problem has come up many, many times, and whether or not we've read the names in headlines doesn't mean that it's not continuing to happen. But even some high-profile cases that have taken place in recent years may have drawn mass attention. However, this particular moment does feel a little bit different. The globe has unified in a way that is new. The movement certainly is not new, but in this moment, people are really watching and paying attention. And so I'm so happy that you all are here listening tonight to learn as well. We saw certainly Amnesty put out an action for George Floyd globally, and it took maybe a week for us to generate 1 million people around the globe who wanted to write into the authorities to try to get justice for George Floyd's family. And so that's really wonderful that there's a lot of enthusiasm there, both from people who are willing to take to the streets in all countries around the world, and particularly here in the US, and also write to the authorities to get some justice. As far as what a staff person at Amnesty, what I'm doing and what the organization Amnesty USA is doing, is we have been invested for a number of weeks in, I guess months now even, some reforms to the way that policing works in the US to the law. So what I focus on at Amnesty and what our work has looked like over the last handful of years is particularly looking at the issue of use of deadly force and the laws that allow for that. Police officers are allowed to use deadly force in accordance with international law. However, it's supposed to be restricted to rare instances where it is as a last resort after other options have been exhausted, and only when there is an imminent threat to life. That, as we know it, is not at all what the laws in the US look like. In 2015, Amnesty authored a report called the Deadly Force Report, where we surveyed every state in the US to determine what their state laws look like, as well as the federal picture of laws, and determined that none of our laws meet those standards. And so it's my job to push them a lot closer to there and hope that we can achieve that one day. But just over the last few months, we've been working with Congress on a number of reforms and a number of partners, some of the organizations I think that Chris even mentioned probably, to try to really make some meaningful change here. And I want to really underscore that while I think there's a very lively conversation in the US about defunding the police and abolishing the police, and all of those arguments have tremendous merit, in my opinion. There's also steps that can be taken right now that are steps towards those directions of recognizing that we should shrink the size of law enforcement in this country, and that we don't need to put all of this money into law enforcement when there are other things that actually benefit communities a lot more, other resources where that money could be reallocated. So I'm not actually going to talk about those other things, but just want to make sure I got that out of the way. The reforms that we've been working on in the US really look to address what we think is meaningful towards bringing accountability. And that is reforms that limit officers' ability to hide behind a shield called qualified immunity, to try to get rid of that. It's something that the US House of Representatives passed in a package. We also work on legislation to try to create a national use of force standard that's much closer in line to those international principles I've discussed as well. Also, particularly given some of the horrific recent killings we've seen, ban the use of chokeholds with criminal penalties, as well as the use of no-knock warrants. When we think particularly about another case you've likely heard of Breonna Taylor in Tennessee. So Kentucky, rather, my apologies. So those are some of the reforms, along with many, many more. And one, I think it's worth noting as well, that would look at providing for the first time, which is shockingly late in American history, protections or additional protections against anti-discrimination in policing. As I mentioned, particularly with regard to the use of excessive force, those patterns also permeate all throughout the criminal penal system. But when we talk about officers pulling people over, those patterns are also replicated there. And so this legislation would sort of track that as well. It's called the End Racial and Religious Profiling Act. And so these provisions have all been included in a package that was passed by the House of Representatives on June 25th. And right now, the Senate is in session, the US Senate or other major body, and they will determine if they're going to take up that piece of legislation. That said, there's another bill that's being authored, I should say, in that same body that we think is a much more watered down version. As referred to by a member of Congress, he referred to this other bill as a greeting card. So clearly not taken particularly seriously. And I think it's disgusting that politicians are able to get away with saying that they're doing something meaningful when there are really people's lives at risk here and people who have died because of this problem. This is not something that we should take lightly at all. So we'll see as Congress proceeds if they will summon the political will to actually do something important. But regardless of what happens at the federal level, it's clear that at the state level, these reforms are already advancing and moving forward. And so that, I think, is also, we're seeing that because both Congress has been willing to discuss this issue in a substantive way that they often do not. They often every year pretend like they're going to do something and don't do almost nothing. And we are also seeing, because of the high profile nature of that, states already starting right now to adopt things and have been doing this long before this moment as well. And so as much pain and outcry has come out of this moment, people are really, as Beverly will say, turning their pain into power and really taking that to the state legislatures, to the courthouses, and the other. So I'm going to stop there because I think I've spoken long enough, and turn it over to our dear colleague and friend Beverly Smith. I have had the pleasure of knowing Beverly for a few years now. I met her through the Coalition of Concerned Mothers a few years ago, and she's an absolutely incredible person, an incredibly strong woman. And so I'm going to turn it over to her to talk a bit more about her story and what we can all learn from.
Hi, good evening, everyone. First, I would like to thank Amnesty Japan for inviting me tonight to participate in this very important conversation. I'm going to talk a little bit about my son. His name was Alonzo Smith. He was a 27-year-old Black man. He was a father of 3. He was also a substitute teacher at a school called Acatink Academy, located in Virginia. It was a middle school for youth who was challenged in the area of their behavior, as well as academics. He was beloved by his faculty as well as his students. My son Alonzo was also a portrait model. He was a very handsome young man, and he knew it. He was very vain. Let's see, let's start with the story. It was on November the 1st, 2015, around 7:20 p.m. I received a knock on my door, and it was two plain internal affair investigators at my door. Mind you, I usually talk to my son. He was living with me at the time, and I talked to him every weekend. And so that particular weekend, I was not able to contact him on that Sunday to see what time he was going to return home. I did not get any calls from him. And everyone that knows him, he's a selfie person. He posts a lot of selfies on Facebook. I didn't see any posts from him that Saturday or that Sunday. So, and I just felt in my spirit that something was wrong. So when those two internal affairs investigators knocked on my door, I let them in my home. And before they said anything, I said to them, what happened to my son? And they looked at each other and they showed me a picture and they said, Miss Smith, is this your son? I said, yes, that's my son. What happened to my son? And they said, Miss Smith, we are sorry to inform you that your son was in a confrontation with two special police officers and he passed. And I said, what do you mean he passed? I said, was he shot? They said, no, Miss Smith. I said, was he stabbed? They said, no, Miss Smith. He was in a confrontation with two special police officers and he passed. And I just completely lost it at that point. That was all they told me. Further on, I'm going to say around a day later, our mayor here in D.C., Mayor Bowser, made a national television conference in regards to my son's death in custody of two special police officers. And she stated that it was a justified homicide. And she made that statement without even an investigation. So the public was in the uproar, and so was I, in her making that statement without an investigation. So she returned the following day and apologized and said that she made a mistake. But to me, you are the mayor and you oversee the Metropolitan Police Department. And so you do not make mistakes like that to say that a homicide is justified by law enforcement without an investigation. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about special police officers. Special police officers, they are licensed by the Metropolitan Police Department. They're also licensed to carry the firearms, but they have a certain amount of jurisdictions that they cover. For instance, they were monitoring the apartment complex where my son was killed on November the 1st. The story is that the residents of an apartment complex, a little after 4 a.m. on November the 1st, they heard and saw my son running, saying, help, help, they're trying to kill me. So they called the local police department. So when the local police department arrived on the scene, my son was inside an apartment complex on the second stairway, head dangling off the steps, handcuffed, and he was also feet cuffed as well. When the two local police officers arrived, they had their body cams on. And so from the time that the local police officers arrived, there is a YouTube video where you can see when the local police officer arrived. You can actually see one of the special police officers with his knee in my son's back. So that is his total body weight compressed into my son's back. And if you will view the video, you can look at the video and you can tell that my son was already dead in that video when the two local police officers arrived. So when the two local police officers arrived, they asked the special police officers, do you know him? And they said, no, we don't know him. One of the other special police officers had my son's cell phone. They asked him, is this your phone? He said no, and threw my son's phone down on the ground. He said, I don't know him. He was walking around like he was on PCP. There was no PCP in my son's system, according to the medical examiner. So because the special police officer said that, the local police officer went back out to his car, got more handcuffs, and feet cuffed my son. Then he realized that he was not breathing. So he tried to resuscitate my son. And the way that he tried to resuscitate my son was incorrectly. I thank him for his efforts, but however, everyone knows that a person has to be laid flat in order to resuscitate them properly. Later on, the medical examiner stated that my son's death in custody of the two special police officers was indeed a homicide. But it was very tricky on the cause and the matter that they labored on his death certificate. They said that the cause was, they said it was cocaine intoxication, and then they said compression of the torso. So of course, you know, they were going to say, oh, well, he had so much cocaine in his system, he had a heart attack. That was not so. The medical examiner did reveal that my son had a hemorrhage in the C2 area of his neck, which means that he was chokehold. He also had hemorrhaging in two areas of his back. That comes from the special police officer with his knee in my son's back. My son's case, my son also, the medical examiner also revealed that my son had bruises and all kinds of scrapes and cuts throughout his body as well. I did not get to view my son's body till almost 12 days later, when his body was released to the funeral home. My son's case went to the grand jury. My son's case stayed with the grand jury for about 10 months. After those 10 months, which was in October of 2016, they had rendered a non-indictment on the two special police officers. I had issues with the grand jury process, which is called an ex parte proceeding, which ex parte meaning one-sided. There was no defense. There was a jury, there was a prosecutor questioning the defendant. The defense attorney for the defendant did not partake in the proceeding. You know, there was once a prominent attorney that once said that it is easy to prosecute a ham sandwich. And what he means by that is because in a ex parte proceeding, because there is no defense attorney partaking in the proceeding, the prosecutor has total control over the grand jury. And so what I mean by that is that if the prosecutor wanted to get an indictment, he could have simply submitted the evidence that he has to the grand jury to get an indictment, and vice versa. If they do not want an indictment, then they will withhold the information that they have let me start over. If they want an indictment, they will present the evidence that they have to the grand jury, and vice versa. If they don't want an indictment, they will withhold what they have from the grand jury. And this is very perplexing to me because in DC, this is the grand jury process that they use, the ex parte proceeding. That proceeding is very biased, and it is in favor of law enforcement. Now, not all states use the ex parte proceeding. Some, the information in regards to police excessive use of force or police homicide, they usually go to the district attorney. But some states, like the District of Columbia, use the ex parte proceeding, which to me is very biased. You do not know who the grand jury is. Everything is a secret. So you don't know who the grand jury is. You don't know. And like I said, the prosecutor has total control over the grand jury. And this is one of the reasons why in all of these cases all over the United States, even when you see videos and you see where the police is using excessive use of force and actually murdering an unarmed person, and when it goes to the grand jury, there is no indictment. And that is one of the reasons why, because of the process that they use that is very biased towards the law enforcement. Now, mind you, when my son was detained by the two special police officers, my son did not commit a crime. My son was not armed. My son should be alive today. And so right now today, you know, because there was no indictment in my son's case, the special police officers, they walked away free. And so the only other recourse of justice that I have is for my three grandchildren, and that's through a civil case, which is in progress now, and it's been 2 years now. And so, you know, just like the most recent police murder of George Floyd, that really caused a lot of anxiety, PTSD, because my son Alonzo was murdered in a similar manner as George Floyd. The special police officer didn't have his knee in his neck like George Floyd, but he had his knee in my son's back, which cut off the oxygen from my son, and ultimately is what killed my son. And so,
There are similarities between the George Floyd incident and your son's incident, and it's tragic because the amount, the what needs to change hasn't changed, and the what's happening in Japan with the Black Lives Matter protests that occurred last month with thousands of people, we're with you in solidarity to try and fight for this change. I think it's difficult for the average Japanese person to understand, for example, the difference between a special police officer and a normal police officer. Can you just talk about that for a little bit?
Yes. Special police officers, they are licensed to carry a weapon. Special police officers are often hired to protect property. Here in the District of Columbia, they are hired to guard government buildings. Also, private apartment complexes, such as where my son was killed, they were hired to monitor that building as well. Special police officers do not have the amount of training that regular local police officers have. They cannot make any arrests on the property that they are hired to protect, but they can detain an individual and then call in a local police. Also, special police officers are not governed under the same rules as regular police officers as well. And because of that, the year that my son was killed by special police officers, a month prior to that, a senior man at a local hospital was choked whole, and he was killed by a special police officers. And because they are not governed under the same rules as local police officers, our mayor, Mayor Mira Browser, she had proposed new rules and regulations for security guards and special police officers in the District of Columbia to retrain them to double their training from 40 hours to 80 hours, and to train them on the usage of not using the excessive use of force, such as asphyxiation, knee in the back, and chokehold. I hope that helped.
It does help. I'm just trying to think within a global context of, in North America, gated communities. Just from personal experience, it's unusual to see anyone besides a police officer. Now, Canada has the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, but it's a recognized uniform. We have local police. The city of Edmonton has a police force, the Calgary Police Service. Japan has the Tokyo Metropolitan Police. But I've been to other places in the world, in Bangkok, for example, where I've seen men holding rifles, protecting property. So I suppose they're there to protect private property and to keep the peace for that.
And they're probably
area. Right.
They're probably also considered as special police officers as well. But, like I mentioned, the proposed new regulations that the mayor had was trying to implement and pass to give to the DC Council to implement, that has not been implemented to date. And my son, it was 4 years last month since she proposed the new rules and regulations to the DC Council. And so what I did was I started a petition last month to get as many signatures as possible so that I can submit to the DC Council so that they can implement those new rules and regulations for special police officers. Just early part of this month, we had an incident with a special police officer at a CVS pharmacy of a special police officer that used excessive force on a gentleman. He chokehold him. Thank God that man lived. But like I said, they're not governed under the same rules and regulations of local police officers, and those proposed rules and regulations need to be implemented as soon as possible so that we won't have another tragic incident like my son and the elder gentleman that was killed. And there was also an incident on our metro system, I believe in 2016, where a metro, which is considered a special police officer, killed a gentleman as well by excessive use of force.
You would think that if these special police officers are trained, but they have, they carry weapons, right? They carry loaded guns.
They carry weapons.
But they
and
do.
After 40 hours of training, they are given a certification and they're given a license to carry a gun.
But that licensing and that training and that ability and responsibility to carry a lethal weapon does not include body cameras.
No, it does not. As a matter of fact, when my son was killed in 2015, and when the mayor released the body cam, DC was on a pilot program. So my son's video was the first video that was released under the district body cam pilot program. And I always say that the reason why I did not have to request to have that body cam released is because it was showing the local police officers in a good light in trying to resuscitate my son. To date, there are several families here who have been impacted by police brutality. Their loved ones have been tragically killed unjustly. And these families have been fighting for years to have the mayor to publicly release the body cam, which to date, it has not been done.
Beverly, there's been a lot of interest. People are learning. I've been learning so much in the last month, weeks. Every time I find a resource, I'm astounded by how much information I don't know. If you could influence the DC government or the national government, or if you could enlighten people wherever they are about the Black Lives Matter movement, how could you sum up their goals? What would be something that the Black Lives Matter movement would want to achieve, or would want the rest of the world to know about?
Thank you for asking that question, because there has been a global misunderstanding in the movement of Black Lives Matter. You hear even some Black people would say, Black Lives Matter. How can they keep saying Black Lives Matter? And we have a high homicide rate, which is considered in the category of community violence in our neighborhood. But there are organizations around the world who do fight community violence. But what people don't understand is the reason that Black Lives Matter was organized. Black Lives Matter was actually organized after the death of Michael Brown and Tamir Rice. Their mission and their goal was to stop police brutality. They wanted police officers to be held accountable for killing unarmed Black and brown men, women, and children with impunity. That was their mission, and that is their mission. And from my experience with the Black Lives Matter chapter here in DC, they were very instrumental in assisting me in fighting for justice for my son. And so I hope with that, that will clear up some misunderstanding that people have of the Black Lives Matter and what their mission is. Their mission, again, is to put a stop to police brutality and end and try to establish laws that will stop police officers from killing Black and brown men, women, and children in a disproportionate rate in the United States with impunity. I do want to add this one thing that I did learn early this morning is that the state of Colorado has a huge victory last Friday. They are the first state and the only state in the United States that passed a true police reform bill. In that reform bill, they have dismantled qualified immunity for law enforcement. They have prohibited chokeholds. They have also prohibited shooting individuals in the back when they're fleeing away from them. They are also making police officers personally liable if they're found guilty of killing someone unjustly. They are personally liable up to $25,000. And there's a few more other reform bills in there as well. So that's the huge victory for Colorado. And it is my hope and it is my prayer that other states will follow Colorado's lead.
Would you say that's an unusual or an outstanding example of where a community has been able to by themselves reform? Otherwise you would need some sort of outside legal apparatus or some kind of policy, because police officers and police jurisdictions don't want to get defunded. That means they will lose their jobs and they will lose their power. So Colorado is a special case.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. It really is. To actually disband qualified immunity is huge.
That's something that
I'm not familiar. No longer can police say, I fear for my life. That's the reason why I shot him. You can no longer just say that and use that as an excuse.
Police officers feel that they're above the law.
Because, you know, that is a line that so many police officers use when they unjustly murder someone. They're known for saying, I fear for my life. You have someone running away from you unarmed. You empty your gun on them and say, I fear for my life. How do you fear for your life when this person is running away from you? You know, but they have been getting away from this for decades. You know, and for such a time as this, you know, I look at the uprising after George Floyd's death. It is an accumulation of all the other unjust murder prior to George Floyd's death. And then when the world seen that police officer with his knee in George Floyd's neck, I mean, I guess the whole world was just saying enough is enough. We have seen too many of these murders on video, and still these police officers get qualified immunity. They are allowed to kill unarmed men, women, and children unjustly with impunity. No accountability at all.
We see like you said, we see these videos almost daily where there's an obvious crime happening. And are there any reports on better approaches to de-escalation and more skillful approaches by police, like improved training? Perhaps that those approaches, this call to defund the police, does that mean instead of a police officer with a loaded weapon, instead of those people getting sent to homes, is there a different kind of peace officer that can be called to de-escalate any kind of situation?
I believe Black Lives Matters had introduced that in this legislation called the NEAR Act. And I think part of that was funded, and that was to train individuals. I'm not certain. I don't want to say this for sure, but I know that was one of the things that BLM DC was looking into, was to train certain individuals to come in and to de-escalate a situation. For instance, when there is a mental health crisis, you know, they feel, and so many other of us feel, that police officers shouldn't be the first ones called to the scene, especially if they are unarmed. There should be someone who is trained in mental health and who have experience in de-escalating a situation when it's involved in mental health.
I could
Yeah, please jump in.
jump in as well. You know, I think with regard to solutions or things that we have seen actually result to fewer people being killed is an example from Washington State, and that Washington State Seattle Police, which has had a horrific record of killing large numbers of people, a record of violence, if you will, they, under President Obama, when President Obama was in office, the U.S. Department of Justice had a policy of oversight of departments through a legal agreement called a consent decree, which they had these agreements with a handful of large police departments in the U.S. And that agreement was a way for our U.S. government to say, our Department of Justice, you are clearly violating people's rights regularly, and to go into departments and investigate and determine what some of the issues were, and help make some change to these departments in and of themselves. And so one of the reasons that Amnesty advocates for these changes to use of force is due to the success that actually happened in Seattle. Now, I'm not by any means suggesting that it is perfect. I don't think there is such a thing as a perfect reform, but that they, in fact, through this consent decree process, changed their use of force standard as at the department level, not in the state law. But that did have an impact through the reporting that was done through the Department of Justice, that they both had fewer deaths that occurred in the custody and a lower crime rate and no increased rate of officer injuries. So to the point that officers suggest that they cannot do their job with being more limited with their ability to use force is incorrect, right? You know, we see people brought into custody all the time. There's a perfect example of that. A young man, Dylan Roof, who went into a church and shot people and killed, I think, 9 people. And they were, the police in that instance managed to bring him into custody. They even took him to a Burger King before they brought him into the station, right? So I think the argument that police are like, well, if you take away our ability to use force, our lives will be at greater risk. And we know that that is not, that, like, there are plenty of examples of how that is not true. And so that is, I think, a real challenge that we face. And in order for these changes to really ever be implemented, it takes officers to believe that their jobs are easier when the community trusts them more and when they're willing to see people where they are and meet people where they're at, especially realizing how much pain people in their position have caused people in the communities they police, whether or not they they themselves are the ones exacting that pain. It's important for them to understand that. And, we can talk about training as important, and I'm not saying that it's not, but I think that we can never look at training as the solution here. And to the extent that, as we've mentioned before, there are, things that help provide transparency in these situations as well. But I really do truly believe that until officers are truly able to be held to the same account as someone who is not a police officer would for violating people's rights, we're going to continue to see these abuses happening. And that's why accountability is really the request. And that's one of the reasons why we say, support the Justice in Policing Act, not this other act that says give every police officer body cameras and training, and that will solve the problem, because we know that it won't solve the problem, right? To the point that Beverly is making, there are very few officers that see any impunity, and that is why qualified immunity is so important. And I know she mentioned it briefly, but I just want to explain it a little bit more because it's a little bit complicated. But basically, qualified immunity is a concept that is established through some cases, like sort of Supreme Court case law. And what it says is that what it prevents basically from happening is officers from being sued from their personal liability as officers. So if they violate someone's rights, it is difficult to sue them. That is the barrier, that barrier in and of itself. That shield is referred to as qualified immunity. The barrier is so high that in order to prove that this is in fact a crime that you're suggesting, there needs to be another case that is so substantially similar to the one that you're referring to, what happened. That is one factor that has to be the same. And that in and of itself is like an absurd barrier to prove, to say like, okay, the same crime has to be repeated in the same way, and the court in one case has to decide in the way that you want. So that is an incredibly high barrier to prove, and as far as liability goes, and we know that it's a huge challenge. It is incredibly important that Colorado has taken this step to eliminate qualified immunity. And I don't know if it's for all state actors, as the concept is supposed to be, or only for police. But either way, it is an incredibly important step and something that all states should be considering. It is part of the legislation that Congress has considered, and folks are pushing for much further of that. As currently we're seeing, of course, that federal law enforcement are violating people's rights as well. And there's a completely separate doctrine that applies to them. And so the conversation needs to understand all of the ways and the lack of protections that people really have, to ensure that police are held accountable when they violate people's rights.
Yeah. And I wanted to also go back to the point that Chris mentioned about, about police officers needing more training. I don't think they really need more training. I think what they need is a mindset change. A lot of these, like I mentioned, that a lot of African American men, women, and children are being, and unarmed, are being murdered at a disproportionate rate. And a lot of them, majority of them, are from white officers. So, it is a known fact that you have a lot of racist police officers that is out here in the community. Just like Chrissy mentioned, the little white guy that went into the church, and he killed all of those black people in the church, but yet they apprehended him and took him to Burger King. So to me, it's not so much at least police officers, local police officers, not special police officers, but local police officers are in need of training. They need a mindset change.
I've seen things shared on social media, for example, this racism scale. Where do you fall? And it goes all the way from overt racism and terrorism to allyship and to people who want to make a space for people of color and are definitely allies. But there's a middle ground where there's this white guilt and woke justification. And we had a question here that some people would tag BLM on Instagram and they wouldn't really know the movement. Is this a sign of support, or is this just superficial? Does this kind of social media hashtag involvement, is this useful? What do you think?
I'm not really I'm not really understanding your question. Can you repeat that again?
If you see, I think on Instagram or Facebook, or people are, I think it was 3 weeks back or so, people put a black square on their Facebook or their Instagram. And maybe that's the extent of their involvement. Do you think that's, obviously it's not enough, but is this helping the issue? Do you think more people?
I think what it's doing is making more people aware, of making more people conscious of what's really happening. So I think it's working in that sense, of making people more aware and trying to get them involved in the movement and to making a change.
I would add to that as well. I think it's important to show that solidarity, and, of course, more engagement is always great. And it's so important when we do this work that we not only take the time to learn more about it, but particularly follow the lead and understand from the people that have been directly impacted by this violence as well, and not just make assumptions about what we think is probably right. And so that's why it's important for us to, and I'm so glad that Beverly is here to be with us. I do think one thing to sort of understand about the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, which I think is, feels so both, feels sort of interesting in this moment, are very both hurtful and strange, and that the movement in itself, certainly as Beverly outlined, was created to address this issue of police killing of Black people of all ages and genders. That said, it very much also stands for the idea that we as Black people are not seen in our full humanity, and that is why those words are chosen to acknowledge that our lives matter. And by our lives, I mean Black people. So that should not be, just to be clear, that should not be seen as a controversial statement, and certainly not amongst human rights activists like yourselves. To put that in context, though, there is often debate about even the term in and of itself, even in places like the halls of Congress, where we have seen politicians and people all over really push back on that notion, and that it comes with some form of aggression, or that it misrepresents something, and that I have seen time and time again folks unequivocally say that phrase, which should absolutely not be controversial, that the humanity of all people is the same, and that the law ought to reflect that too. And that's really what this is about. And so I think that's important to understand as well. And it's incredible to see the global movement of support and solidarity, and even something that may seem like small really can be meaningful to someone, because there are people that really see this movement as something harmful, which is not the point at all.
Absolutely, it's not. And education, the field I'm very passionate about, is very, very important. When people say all lives matter, either they're confusing the goals of Black Lives Matter, or they really do think that they are superior.
Yeah, they're confusing the goals and don't actually know the mission of Black Lives Matter. So, I would advise people to get a better understanding of the mission of Black Lives Matter. You can Google it. You can Google the mission of Black Lives Matter.
Beverly, I have a question here. How did you control your anger dealing with the emotions towards police and the law? And how do you continue to do that? Is anger the most appropriate label for what you feel?
That's a good question. The anger, the frustration, and the disappointment that I had over the unjust murder of my son, it compelled me to get involved in the movement, to do something to help prevent this from happening to someone else. I have been blessed to have an abundance of organizations that assist me during the time that my son was murdered. Black Lives Matter, there was an organization that was birthed that I am a co-founder of, which is Pan African Community Action, that I'm not that active with, but they was the organizers of the Justice for Zoe campaign. Also, I was introduced to, and who I am a core member of today, is the Coalition of Concerned Mothers. And we are a group of mothers who have been impacted by police brutality or community violence. And we get together, and our mission is to create collaborative relationships with families who have been impacted by police brutality and community violence, and we assist them in any way that we can. And what we also do, we have made plenty of trips up to Congress and talk to congressmen and congresswomen and trying to get legislative fast. So I try to turn, as Christy has stated earlier, that one of my slogans is turning pain into power. I'm also the founder of a grief and healing support group called Circle of Love and Support, and it's for family members, who loved ones has been killed by police brutality or community violence. So me actually getting involved and directing my anger into something positive, into making change, and of course my prayer life and the abundance of support from various organizations in DC has really helped me.
We've got a few more questions here. I wonder. Okay, so there's one question here. How can we challenge color blindness mindset? How can we challenge a color blindness mindset? Can you speak to that?
How to change a color blindness mindset. As we all know, a lot of times we're not born being racist. Being racist is taught. Actually, it's been taught in the environment that we grew up in, whether it's our family or out socially, it is taught. I believe that one of the ways that we can change that mindset is that we have to start seeing people, and like Dr. Martin Luther King stated, we have to judge people not by the color of their skin, but the contents of their character. We have to stop judging people by the color of their skin and really judge the person for who they are. And we have to, people have to dispel a lot of myths that they hear about different races and get to know people for yourself.
I think that's, first of all, that's an excellent quote. And I think that should be on every wall of every classroom in the world, not just in Tokyo or in Japan. Because Japan, I grew up in a place where it was very multicultural. The Edmonton Heritage Days Festival has 100 different tents in the summer on a long weekend. And all of those people are residents of Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. But the tents are from Afghanistan or Ukraine China or Argentina. We actually had a tent from Nashville, Tennessee, too, like a sister tent, and it's a wonderful atmosphere where we all know the same. We all share the same values of teaching our children about love and respect. And I think these are just universal global values that we all share. And Japanese people are in a situation where 99% of the country don't get those people from different cultures. And whenever they see someone who looks differently, they don't know how to relate because they don't have that experience. So our issue here is how do we get more people involved with Black Lives Matter in Japan, and how do we get more students involved and informed about Black Lives Matter? And I think you mentioned before the Black Lives Matter website is an amazing resource, but
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. I mean, that's what I would advise people to do. Is to Google Black Lives Matter. I think it's just BLM.org, and learn about their mission, and then learn about the chapters in your area, and see how you can possibly get involved and what you can do to help change the current situation with police brutality right now. You know, a lot of people, and I always say, you know, I was compelled to get involved in this movement through the murder of my son, but I always advise people, you know, don't wait until tragedy hits your doorstep before you get involved, because this can happen to anybody at any given time. So I advise people to try and get involved now. And don't wait until, God forbid, tragedy hits your doorstep before you get involved. And if not with Black Lives Matter, there is tons of other organizations out there fighting against the injustices of police brutality.
And these days we're hearing more about the term intersectionality, where you have Black Lives Matter crossing the Venn diagram with poverty, and now we have this Venn diagram crossing over into climate change, where you've got people in Black communities, for example, in Cancer Alley, that are exposed to extremely high, unusually high levels of pollution, and these same poor communities are suffering suffering from coronavirus at 8-10 times the level of other communities, and it's all starting a conversation that is really important, and everyone is starting to learn about how these things and these groups are interconnected, and the solutions are also sometimes very common.
Yeah, I'll speak a little more to intersectionality because I know it's a concept that not even everyone in the US understands, but it's really a concept that was born and is a theory created by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, and was made to address the reality that in the workplace at the time, women faced particular discrimination because women were newer to the workplace, and that discrimination was also compounded for Black women because they face a different kind of discrimination, including racial discrimination and gender-based discrimination. And so the concept really was born about understanding the different elements of our identities do come with various barriers to our entry into how we are perceived and get to live in society. And so that is the foundation behind that concept. And we see it play out in a lot of other things. Certainly, as you mentioned, Chris, that when we think about people that are living in poverty, and then also if those people are a racial minority or an ethnic minority, or if those people are able-bodied, or if those people have XYZ other things, right? There's lots of different things about us that may, for some reason, for some people, that for us to be treated differently. And so understanding those and the sort of principle and concept that, none of us will be free until all of us are free, and that we recognize some of the people that are the absolutely most marginalized because of their identities is very true. If we find a way for those individuals to be able to experience equal justice under the law, then at that point, everyone's going to be okay. But as a society, that's not a decision that we've made at all, right? We talk about a lot, and it's even a comment that could be made, and that is sort of the intention behind the Say Her Name campaign. So as Beverly has shared, certainly, and is statistically true that in America, Black men are the primary audience impacted by this police violence. However, it also happens to Black women, and we hear traditionally a lot less about those cases of when it happens. Right now, Breonna Taylor's name is in a lot of people's minds, and she's certainly one of the most high-profile cases of a Black woman that was killed. But there's also, what about people of color that are from the trans community that are also killed by police and in other ways in very large numbers that don't get as much attention? And so by recognizing these different facets about ourselves, it's important to understand how we are able to experience our full humanity, despite the fact that we should all be considered the same, but we often don't see that as the case.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that people who are silent are either part of the problem or content with the status quo?
Well, it takes, I think, as Beverly said, don't wait until this hits your doorstep, right? And you don't have to, it certainly is a really different fight if it's something that you're personally impacted by, of course. That said, some people say that silence is violence in this case, and that may be the case, that for some people, they are uncomfortable with doing something to sacrifice their comfort for somebody else's. That might be the case. And the principle behind, again, like going back to this case about like understanding that all of our humanity is considered the same, it's not that we take away that from other people. It's that we acknowledge that we have the despite the color, race, skin, gender, sexuality, any of these other pieces of our identity, we're not saying that like you all of a sudden get less white man because I get more Black woman. It just means that we are viewed differently, and we view each other with the same amount of dignity and respect, and that our laws reflect that as well. And I think that notion that people tend to at times be concerned about that, it's because of a concern about what they may mean for their ability, for their progress, for their of their generations of people that, frankly, in the US, like there is a very lively debate right now about reparations, and that all these years later, people of African descent, Black people, have not been given reparations for really building this country and the work that has gone into this. Like the White House was built by slaves. My mom's last name is Washington, which may mean that her ancestors were George Washington slaves. So I could not be more of a Washingtonian if I wanted to be. And, I think the idea that recognizing the sins of America and building this nation on the backs of Black people, and not justifying that through any recourse or remedy, which is certainly an international mechanism, a right to remedy, is a real conversation that is happening right now. And for some people, it is hard to grapple with and understand that they themselves didn't have anything to do with the reason for those challenges, those sins of our past forefathers. But that doesn't mean that they shouldn't seek to correct those mistakes now. And so that is the question that we are grappling with in the US right now, is whether or not we are going to decide to change as a country. There's clearly been, the veneer has been peeled back about people who have held these views for a long time that are now willing and openly able to express their hatred towards others. And the question is, how are we going to deal with that in this moment, and how are we going to address where it came from, and try to recover from that?
And luckily, precedent has been set. Desmond Tutu and jurisdictions and people all over the world have talked about what's happened in South Africa with the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. And there have been many Truth and Reconciliation committees that understand that we're in a system and that we can't necessarily name and shame people because of history, and we have to allow room for people to acknowledge the truth. That's a tenet of the Extinction Rebellion. Their first tenet is just tell the truth. Just get it out in the open. Let's have a discussion about it, and let's solve the issue together. It's a really big issue. They're all connected. I'm just going to read some comments, and then I'm going to give Beverly the last word here. This issue requires global support too. All countries should speak out against those U.S. law enforcement practices affecting people of color disproportionately to help end systematic racism. Another comment, all lives won't matter until Black lives matter. Beverly, I'm so sorry for your loss. Your story is very illuminating. Thank you for telling it. Thank you so much for bringing this talk to Japan. Beverly, right before I give you the last word, I just want to mention an upcoming event on August 8th from 10 a.m. to 12. Members of Amnesty International Tokyo English Network I-10 invite you to an online presentation and conversation hosted by the University Network for Human Rights and residents of St. John Parish in Louisiana about the health and environmental damage to their community from the emissions of a Japanese chemical company. There will be a translation into Japanese and a bilingual Q&A session. Please join us. We got Fast and Furious questions coming up. I need that link. Let's see here. So Beverly, please, any final comments?
Yes, I wanted to go back to when a person had a question of changing the mindset of racism. I also believe that we have to, each individual need to change their mindset, but it has to start from the top too. And what I mean from the top is the 1% ruling class and also white supremacy. We have to do away with white supremacy. Again, I advise everyone to try and get involved with an organization who is fighting against police brutality. You know, we all have to come together and we have to fight this fight together in solidarity and in unity because it's actually a war out here. And it is us against them. And it's going to continue to go on. We can no longer be silent and stand back and watch this happen, talk among each other, but not actually getting involved and trying to do something to stop it. Again, as I advised earlier, you can go to Google, you can type in BLM.org, and you can find a chapter in your country, in your state, or seek any other organization who's involved in the fight against police brutality and see how you too can get involved. Everyone has something to offer. It's so important that everyone get involved and try to end this fight against police brutality because, again, it can happen to any one of us, regardless of your race, your status, your color. It just so happens that it's happening in a disproportionate rate in the Black community, but it can happen to any one of us at any given time.
Beverly Smith, I want to thank you very, very much for your time, and thank you for sharing your story. It's very important within the context of Japanese students and educators. They need to know the details. They need to know the truth. And thank you very much for sharing. Kristina Roth, thank you very much for enduring the thunder and lightning and helping us out with Amnesty International in DC. Thank you very, very much for both of you. And I'm looking forward to staying connected with you and following up and letting more people know, as many as possible on social media or in classrooms or with NPO groups, about the issue of Black Lives Matter. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. I hope we all take Beverly's infectious laughter into, as we continue to fight for these very painful issues, but recognize that we still also deserve to be joyful in doing so.
Absolutely. Thank you for your time, and take care and all the best. Oh, thanks everyone here at Amnesty International, and everyone who came online. That's right, and everyone who came online. Thank you very much for your time, and take care. Black Lives Matter.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.